Public Issues. I'm John Chowning with Campbellsville University. Kentucky voters on November 5th will be choosing several statewide constitutional officers, and as we do every 4 years, we have invited all the Republican and Democratic candidates for our statewide offices for interviews here on Dialogue on Public Issues. We're very honored today to have the Republican nominee for Kentucky Secretary of State, Mr. Michael Adams. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
We appreciate your taking time. We know you're busy
Thank
you. You move toward November 5th. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in Paducah, first in my family to have the chance to get a college degree. I did well enough there that I got into Harvard Law School and was able to go there on low-income aid. After that, I worked for Senator McConnell, Governor Fletcher. I was his number 2 attorney in his administration. Then I got a call from the White House to go to Washington. I was appointed counsel to the Deputy Attorney General of the United States at the age of 30. So I went to Washington. I worked primarily on anti-terrorism matters, helping draft regulations to investigate suspected terrorists. It was a great thing to be in and serving my country. But toward the end of the Bush administration, I really wanted to find a way to get back into politics. That's really my love, always has been. I started consulting Republican candidates when I was still a teenager, before I was old enough to vote. So I got a call from just 9 blocks down the street at the Republican Governors Association. I became their general counsel. And so for 12 years I was their general counsel, the first 5 as an employee, and then the last 7, and to this day I've counseled them, but it's been via a law firm practice. So I opened up in early 2012 a national election law practice for Republicans and conservatives. So I've represented Vice President Pence. I actually am his political law attorney. The National Federation of Republican Women, Republican members of Congress, conservative groups across the country, referendum campaigns, and so forth. And so what I do is I help them comply with the election laws. I help them get elected, and I also help them comply with the laws after they get elected, help them govern.
Now, why did you choose in 2019 to become a candidate for Kentucky Secretary of State?
Well, because of the deep and extensive experience I have as an election law expert, Governor Bevin appointed me to the Kentucky State Board of Elections in 2016, and I served under Allison Lonergan Grimes, and I saw things there that troubled me. I did what I could within the system to fix those, but ultimately I concluded that the only way that I could fix them was to quit the job that I enjoyed on the board and run for her job as the chief election official, which is what the Secretary of State is.
You mentioned basically most people see the Secretary of State in that role. What are the constitutional and statutory duties of Kentucky Secretary of State?
Well, there are actually no constitutional responsibilities. The office for the first 100 years of our Commonwealth was not elected. It was something the governor appointed, and then the decision was to make that independent office in 1892, and so since then it's been elected. But the duties change by statute. They change, in fact, they changed as recently as this year. Some of Allison Grimes' duties were stripped away because of ethics concerns about her performance in office. So there are no constitutional responsibilities. It's the General Assembly that decides. There are a number of things that the office does in terms of record keeping, whether it be land records, legislative records, if the governor signs legislation or vetoes, they've got all that stuff, executive orders. That's really just form stamping and record keeping. It's administrative purely. There's one role that's the primary role in terms of statutory references in the code and in terms of actual policymaking authority, and that's as the chief election official. And so that's why I'm very proud to be a candidate for this office. I'm the only candidate actually who's ever run who had significant election law experience.
Do you think it's vital that we continue to elect that office? Obviously, I assume so. You're running for the office. But why? Why do you think it's important to elect the Secretary of State rather than an appointive or type office?
Sure. What you see in our laws is a desire to have some independence from the governor. It's nothing personal to this governor. It's every governor for 100 years. A desire by the legislature to have the elections be run independently. So they broke up some of the responsibilities among the Secretary of State in that person's office and some among the State Board of Elections. But yeah, I think we need to have checks and balances within the government. That's how we have a freer people, is by having checks and balances.
What are the major issues in this race? Your opponent is Heather French Henry, who has served in public office as well as being the wife of a former Kentucky Lieutenant Governor and Miss America. But what are the primary issues in this particular race for Secretary of State?
I'd love to tell you what hers are, but I haven't the foggiest notion. She's not actively campaigning. In the month of July, she had 1 day of campaign appearances. She's dodging public forums. I hope that you get to talk to her. Generally, she charges people a cost to hear her speak. So she's running a different campaign. I really couldn't tell you what her campaign's about. I'll tell you what mine's about. Number one is restoring integrity to this office. You have an incumbent Secretary of State who's the subject of multiple investigations, civil and criminal, on such allegations as misuse of the voter file for personal political purposes, a no-bid contract to a major donor who apparently didn't do that much work, refusal to clean up the voter rolls despite a federal court order to do so, allegations of retaliation against whistleblowers. It's just one thing after another, and my opponent has been totally silent on every single one of these scandals. She's actually raising money from Allison Grimes' own staffers, which makes me think she intends to keep those people in office when she takes over. So if there's any one office in our government that has to be above suspicion and reproach, it's this office, the chief election official. I want to restore integrity of that office. That's my biggest issue. In terms of policies, we have a few that I could walk you through where we disagree. The biggest one probably is photo ID to vote.
Okay.
A lot of people are surprised to learn that Kentucky law does not require a photo ID to vote. The poll worker is allowed to ask if that person chooses to ask for a photo ID, but they don't have to. And if they do ask, the voter can refuse. It's a huge loophole in our law. Other states had similar loopholes and they've closed them. Our neighboring states, Indiana, Tennessee, Virginia, have all fixed their loopholes. States around the country have. Wisconsin, North Carolina, purple states, red states, blue states. It's one more example where we're behind the rest of the country. Heather French Henry has said she opposes a law to require a photo ID to vote. That's a big difference between the two of us. Another big difference is cleaning up the voter rolls. There are estimates that we have hundreds of thousands of people on our rolls who legally shouldn't be. Either they don't live here anymore, or in fact they're actually dead, which is a good reason to come off the voter rolls. Right. Allison Grimes, for 7 years, refused to maintain the voter rolls and actually bragged about that publicly, saying it was voter suppression to purge the rolls. I disagree with that. But even if I agreed with her, I would still do it because you have federal law that was passed by a Democratic Congress and signed by Bill Clinton, and a state law passed by a Democratic General Assembly and signed by Governor Burton Jones, a Democrat, all of which require us to regularly maintain our voter rolls to ensure people are not on there who shouldn't be. And we haven't adequately done that. Since Allison Grimes has been deposed by law, you now have a Republican chairman of the State Board of Elections, Josh Branscombe, from not too far from here. Right. He's begun the process of trying to clean this up, but his term ends here in about 4 months. My concern is if Heather Henry is in charge of this office, we'll never clean this up. She's been asked if she will pursue this. She says we need to study this. It's not time to study this. We're years and years backlogged, and we're under a federal court order to do this from a year ago. We can't study this. We got to actually fix it.
Why is it? What is the rationale? I know you support purging the rolls, but what is the rationale or the argument for not removing the names of those who have passed away?
I would love to ask Heather Henry that if she would show up occasionally and answer a press question or attend a public forum. So I have no idea what her position is.
And the purging of inactive, it's only after what, four successive elections in which a person has not voted? There's
a very specific process in federal and state law. Right. It's very generous, but also very specific. We belong to a compact. We were the 28th state to join, an interstate compact where we trade information with other states about who's moving in or out of our state. We also get information from the Postal Service, change of address forms. So we get that information in Frankfurt. And so by law, if we see that someone shouldn't be on our rolls based on this information, we don't just assume that that's right, because sometimes the government databases are wrong. So what we do is we find that person's information, we mail that person a postcard, or we're supposed to. That's the whole point, is that we've not been adequately doing this. We're supposed to send that person a postcard and say, hey, are you still at this address? Do you still live here? If that person mails it back and says, no, I'm gone, they come off the rolls. Most people don't return those cards. If they don't return the card, then by law, we're supposed to wait through 2 successive federal elections, 2 even-yeared elections, and see if that person doesn't vote. So if you've got 3 prongs, they don't respond, they don't vote, and then they don't vote again, they're supposed to come off the rolls. That's the law. And again, this was a Democratic initiative. This is not partisanship trying to kick Democrats off the rolls. This is enforcing their law.
Those who oppose voter ID make the claim that it is discriminatory towards certain voting blocks or voting groups. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think they should read the Supreme Court opinion written by Justice John Paul Stevens, the late justice who just passed away about a month ago. He was the most liberal member of the court, and he actually wrote the opinion sustaining the constitutionality of photo ID when it was challenged. It was sustained by a very lopsided majority of the U.S. Supreme Court. Indiana did the same thing in 2004. They were sued by the ACLU, went to the Supreme Court. The court said, this is fine, this is entirely legitimate. Now, specifically what Indiana did is they said, we're not going to have a poll tax. We're not going to charge people to get an ID to go vote. I'm not for that either. We're going to have a free ID available to people if they don't have a driver's license that they want to pay for. But we're going to have a way that we can verify everybody's identity. I've yet to receive any real objection from anybody, and I've campaigned, it'll be today 103 counties, hundreds of stops all across the Commonwealth for a year and a half. I've yet to have one person tell me they disagree with me on this issue. I think even Democrats agree that photo ID makes sense.
There's been a lot of media reports and controversy throughout the nation about Russia's attempt to influence the elections and to hack into voter systems around the nation. Going into this fall's election and then the presidential election cycle in 2020, do you think Kentucky is fairly well protected, fairly well prepared to protect the integrity of our voting systems and to preclude any foreign nation or even any domestic group that might try to hack into our voting systems and impact it?
Yeah, I think we're about as well prepared as we could be with a couple of exceptions.
Okay.
So first point I'd like to make is ultimately it's Congress and the Department of Homeland Security who are going to have the information.
Right.
And the question is, what level of involvement should they have in our elections? I'm a Federalist. I believe that we need to run our own elections. That's what the Constitution provides for. But we can work collaboratively with Washington, D.C. to improve our security. One big difference between me and the incumbent now is that she uses her platform to troll the president on Twitter, troll the Senate Majority on Twitter, leader on Twitter. I think you need a leader who will be fair and play it straight and not be political with this office. You need someone who can work with Washington collaboratively. And given my work with the Vice President, my work with Senator McConnell, I feel confident that I can use those relationships in a favorable way, but still play it straight and not be Republican or Democrat in the office. One thing I can tell you that is a concern, I saw this in the year and a half that I served on the State Board of Elections. There are vulnerabilities. I think we do a very good job watching out for foreign actors, but I think we have some weak spots. I'll give you one specifically. In my last meeting on the State Board of Elections before I had to resign to be a candidate, we got back the results of a cybersecurity audit. What we found is that numerous county clerks around the state did not have secure Wi-Fi. They would do one of two things. Either they would have no password on the Wi-Fi, unprotected, or they would have a password on it, but they would write it on a Post-it and put it up in the lobby, which doesn't really help you a lot. You can't get in the election and hack it through the Wi-Fi, but you can access the voter registration database through the Wi-Fi. So you can't flip an election, but you can certainly sow doubt and discord. And if you look at what Russia did, that's what they did. They didn't tip the election, but they made us turn on ourselves by sowing discord. They put a lot more effort into putting out tweets and retweets and social media posts, turning groups against each other than they did trying to hack into machines. That's where our biggest vulnerability as a country is. It's our internal discord.
Right. Yeah, they did not affect the integrity of the outcome, contrary to what some might say or fear.
I don't think that Russia, or for that matter, a domestic actor, a prankster or anyone, can get in the database and change enough voter registration records to tip an election. What they can do is sow doubt about the system so that for every one person whose information is hacked, there are 100 who don't trust the election process.
Given that you're a Federalist, and I think most people would agree with that elections are essentially the responsibility of the states under our system, what is that proper role of the federal government and the state government? And as Secretary of State, what would you advocate what is the proper interaction and assistance that the federal government would give Kentucky, for example?
Well, the Constitution plainly states that the states shall have shall dictate the time, place, and manner of the elections. The very first bill that Nancy Pelosi introduced when she became the House Speaker in January of this year, the very first one, and this is the signal of what their most important priority is for the entire 2-year Congress. That's usually your first bill. H.R. 1, House Resolution 1, was a bill to federalize all of our elections. It was a bill to prohibit states from requiring a photo ID to vote. It was a bill to prohibit states from purging their voter rolls of people they know shouldn't be on their rolls. If you look at what the Democratic Party is pushing, it's these things. It's abolishing the Electoral College, which would be a disaster for Kentucky. My opponent agrees with a lot of that agenda. I'm on the other side of it. I'm a conservative, and I think that Washington has their role. The number one role, they have two roles. One is they are in a better position than us to gather intelligence about foreign threats. Obviously, that's their skill set, not ours. What they also can do is provide grants to pay for what we need in Kentucky. I'll give you an example. We have a lot of counties in Kentucky that have not upgraded their equipment recently. I think they have concerns about ADA in terms of having enough machines accessible to those with disabilities. Very few counties in our state universally use paper ballots, kind of electronically. The gold standard, as far as I'm concerned, is paper ballots that are then counted electronically. If you've got an electronic-only machine like most of our counties have, then there's no way to know if there's a malfunction or a hack because you don't know how people actually voted.
Right.
If you've got Scantron sheets and you've got a paper backup, but you've also got the speed of counting electronically, what I'd like to use my platform for is to help counties apply for grants from Washington. Right now, the state legislature does not provide enough money to our counties to run their elections. There's actually a formula in state law that the State Board of Elections has to functionally ignore because they don't get the funding in turn to fund that. So I want to use my relationships with the Republicans in the legislature to get more funding at the state level, but also at the federal level.
Okay. How prevalent do you think, Mr. Adams, election fraud is in Kentucky? And what steps would you take as Secretary of State in concert with other officials and agencies to combat it?
Sure. Well, I see election fraud as being like terrorism. It doesn't happen all the time.
Right.
And there are people that I think probably oversell the threat and oversell the frequency, but it's real. There's a very famous case from Clay County just in the past decade when you had a county judge executive, you had multiple officials, you had supporters, all indicted and prosecuted and criminalized in a big scheme. Where you tend to see most election fraud actually isn't on the general election day. I can't think of an example in modern times where you've had a general election tipped by fraud that we know about.
Right.
Where you tend to see fraud is in primaries, because you don't have the checks and balances. You don't have the Republican poll workers with Democratic challengers watching them and vice versa. You need checks and balances. And when you see election fraud, it tends to be, frankly, in Eastern Kentucky where people are poorer and fraud makes a little more financial sense, unfortunately, because of the socioeconomics. But also, specifically, it happens in a primary situation, a Democratic primary or a Republican primary, because you don't have the other side watching. It is a recurrent problem. Almost every election cycle, you see at least one federal indictment coming down. It tends to be the feds that come in and enforce these cases because they're independent. They can come in, and there's no political pressure to stop them like there might be at the state level with the local prosecutor. It's real and it happens and it's documented. I think it's like terrorism. It doesn't happen every day.
Right.
But with photo ID, how often do you see people hijack planes? Not terribly often, but you still ask for an ID when people get on a plane. It's the same thing with voting.
We used to have years and years ago, there were multiple cases of people going cross county boundaries and voting multiple times, but that's one of the reasons that voter ID is important, I would assume.
It is.
And the technology has helped cut down on that.
Well, I think one thing that the Board of Elections has done that's been an improvement is using e-poll books, electronic poll books.
Right.
We can get information in real time of who's voted, and that will help.
Exactly. That was a very good innovation. Related to that, what are some signs in a primary of that there might be a problem in County A, B, or C? If you're in Frankfort looking at the numbers, what are some of the signs that there may be something going on in a county somewhere out in the state?
Well, unfortunately, there's not much information that comes to Frankfurt in real time before an election to be able to pick up on a conspiracy or a scheme. The State Board of Elections from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. receives complaints in real time. It's
Okay.
actually a very sophisticated system. We have a call-in number, and we get hundreds of complaints on election day, and we get them in real time across personalized monitors. And then we can call local officials and make follow-ups. And so it's actually a very active process. But there's not much that we can do in advance of that unless we have evidence.
Are absentee ballots the easiest way, you think, in primaries to perhaps have election fraud?
I think today, no, but I
Okay.
think it could get that way, and I'll give you a reason. Right now, on average, absentee ballots tend to be about 2% of the total votes
Okay.
cast. And most elections aren't decided by 2% of the vote.
right.
And if they were, you still have to have a significant majority, and that would be a tip that there's fraud going on. If you had absentee ballots that didn't reflect the rest of the pool, almost every time the absentee ballots reflect the rest of the pool. So in terms of evidence in advance of the election, you don't count your absentee ballots until election day when the polls are closed. But if you've got a big deviation between your absentee count and how the rest of the election went, you know something's up.
Yeah.
I'm in favor of our current system of absentee voting, where people, if they have a reason they can't vote on election day, can vote by mail or vote early at their county courthouse. My opponent's in favor of functionally abolishing election day, where everyone votes by mail. I don't think that you're going to have a security problem with 2% of people voting by mail. I think you've got a big problem with 100% of people voting by mail.
Do you support any expansion of early voting above and beyond that absentee, where you actually have to, if you vote early, you have to actually assert or certify that you're going to be unavailable to vote on election day? Do we need to do anything beyond that in
Well,
Kentucky?
I am in favor of expanding the polling hours. I don't think it's realistic to ask a poll worker. Most of our poll workers are senior citizens. I don't want to ask them to work a 14 or an 18-hour shift instead of 12. 12 is long enough. I'd like to break up the shifts to be 6 or 7-hour shifts,
Okay.
so we can get more people in the process. I'm in favor of expanding the hours. I'm not in favor of letting anybody vote anytime they want ever with no reason. For a couple of reasons. One reason is it raises the cost of elections significantly, because instead of one election day, you've got 30 or 40 or 50 election days. We already have a huge problem finding poll workers for one day. Imagine doing that times 30 or 40 or 50. And studies show and experience shows it doesn't really increase the turnout. It just spreads it out over a longer period of time. The biggest issue is states that have enacted this early voting found it didn't work. They tried to repeal it, and then the repeals were struck down by federal courts, saying, well, once you open this up, you can't close that box.
I would presume that online voting would not work, or with at least the potential for lots of abuse would be prevalent.
Well, I'm certainly against it. I am in favor of online voter registration. We've had that for a while, and it makes sense. Actually, it makes more sense than paper registration in terms of having the data be right, because what's the person going to do at the clerk's office? They're going to take the card and then type all the information in, and then you have another angle for possible data entry error.
Is there a better day of the week? Would a Saturday, for example, be a better day to vote than Tuesday, in your opinion? Would that
Yeah, possibly.
increase?
I'm not in favor of making Election Day a national holiday for a couple of reasons. One is it impacts the private sector. Then they've got to pay people to not work, and that's a cost on them and impacts jobs. Number two, if you make it a holiday, people who have kids in daycare, well, daycare's closed for the holiday. So that actually makes things harder on working parents who want to vote. So I'm not in favor of that. Voting on a Saturday is a lot more
Is
defensible.
do we need to streamline further, or is it working, the process of letting those serving in the military vote, particularly those serving overseas? Is that process working okay?
Our end
As
of it is working, and I'll give Secretary Grimes credit. Obviously, I've had my disagreements with her. I think she's done a good job on this issue.
Okay.
She's worked with the legislature to come up with what I think is one of the better models for this. But unfortunately, all we can control is the state side of it. The reason you have military votes not being counted promptly is because the military has their own internal process for acquiring these ballots and shipping them back to the states of origin, and it's very slow, and sometimes these ballots aren't mailed by election day, and then they're not counted. So I think the military has to do a better job of it.
Okay. You mentioned earlier in the interview about current Secretary of State Grimes having her certain duties being removed by the legislature in the most regular session of this year, and no longer presiding as the chair of the State Board of Elections. If you're elected as Secretary of State, will you work with the Republican majorities in the House and Senate to restore that function and any other functions that were removed?
Well, when I first get there, I'm going to wait and see. I'd like to see how functional the board is with its head basically cut off, which is what we've got. Right now, they rotate chair people, and I think they're working better than they were working under Allison Grimes. I do agree with the legislation splitting off the board and having it be independent of the Secretary of State. I do think we should, at least based on the experience that we have over maybe the next 6 months, reconsider allowing the Secretary of State to chair. Right now, it's an actual prohibition.
Right.
Clearly, this law wasn't designed for me, or for that matter for Mrs. Henry. It was designed for one person and to fix that one situation. I think based on conversations I've had with legislators, they've told me they're open to reassessing this law and possibly changing that. It's not going to be high on my agenda. My agenda is cleaning up the corruption and fixing up the voter rolls and imposing a photo ID requirement. If I conclude that I can't have enough influence indirectly, and then I need direct influence by being chair of the board in order to get the voter rolls cleaned up, then I'll ask for that power. I'm not sure that I'll need to.
What was the problem in viewing the voter rolls, or what was she doing with the voter rolls, to your knowledge?
So this has been very well documented by actually a left-wing organization called ProPublica, which joined up with a left-wing newspaper, the Lexington Herald Leader. So the reason I point that out is not to criticize, not whatsoever. My point is that Secretary Grimes accused them of sexism, and these are not sexist people. The reporter was a woman. So ProPublica and Lexington Herald Leader spent months investigating this. They had multiple sources. They released a multi-part expose on the performance of Secretary Grimes, raised a lot of the issues that I referred to earlier. What they found here specifically was that top deputies of Secretary Grimes were accessing the voter file and pulling certain individuals' voting behavior. And those individuals happened to be prospective rivals of Secretary Grimes had she chosen to run for governor.
Right.
Now their position is, hey, well, look, no harm was done, this is fine. Nothing was adulterated, we're just looking at information. But the legislature felt differently to the extent that they actually had to criminalize that sort of activity.
We're down to under a minute. Why don't you take a moment and speak to the voters?
Well, thank you all for watching today. I'm Michael Adams. I'm the Republican candidate for Secretary of State. I'm the only conservative running for this office. I'm endorsed by Kentucky Right to Life and have an A rating from the NRA. On election law issues, I'm the only candidate who wants to clean up our voter rolls, require a photo ID to vote, and is willing to speak to all the corruption under Allison Grimes.
Michael Adams.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. God bless you, and
Thanks a
Godspeed
lot.
out on the campaign trail.
Thanks so much.
This is John Chowning interviewing Michael Adams, the Republican nominee for Kentucky Secretary of State, urging all the voters to study the issues, look at the candidates, make informed choices on Tuesday, November 5th. Thank you.